Yo, what's going on guys, it's G Miners here, and in today's video I wanted to go over armor stats in Destiny 2 and explain what each one does and why you should prioritize certain armor stats over others for PvE. I made a video covering how to get the best armor for endgame builds and touched on these stats slightly, but ended up getting a ton of comments asking why I choose certain stats like recovery over something like resilience. I'm going to go through each stat in order from mobility to strength and explain what each does, when you should use them, and what I personally use for endgame content and builds. If you want to skip around to different stats, I will have chapters built into the video so you can just drag the scroll bar to wherever you want to start off. This video will be a bit longer than my usual videos because there is a lot to unpack. Starting off with mobility, this increases your movement speed and your jump height. More specifically, for movement speed, this is just how fast you move while you are not sprinting. Mobility will never increase your max sprint speed. On top of this, the bonus jump height from mobility only increases your first jump. This will never increase the overall distance or height of your double jump ability, regardless of the class you are playing. Overall, mobility should be used in 3 different circumstances. First would be when you actually prefer the bonus movement speed and jump height. If you like strafing extremely fast and having a high base jump to allow you to easily mantle onto tall objects, mobility might be something you want to spec into. Second, if you are speedrunning or want to learn how to speedrun, max mobility can be useful. This really comes down to circumstances and the class you are playing. For example, on Warlock, low mobility might be preferred as it allows you to chain burst glides together slightly quicker. Burst gliding relies on how fast you can burst forwards and towards the ground repeatedly, so having higher mobility will increase your base jump height, making chaining burst glides together much slower. Stat-wise, mobility can increase your jump height and movement speed up to 40% when at tier 10 or 100 mobility. All mobility values for each tier are shown on screen now. If you are playing Hunter, mobility will also affect how quickly your class ability, otherwise known as your dodge, cools down. Once again, these values for each tier are shown on screen. By using max mobility on Hunter, you can decrease this cooldown by over 20 seconds. By playing Hunter and using mobility for a cooldown, this would be the third circumstance where running mobility would make sense. Overall, with mobility, I play on Warlock at tier 3 or around 30 stat points. This is what my armor is at, and it is what I am used to playing on. In most cases, I wouldn't recommend prioritizing high mobility unless you have the stat points to spare. In endgame content, unless on Hunter, I don't see mobility as something that necessarily helps you. Next up is resilience. This stat increases the maximum health that your shield has, and with stasis being added to the game, resilience now reduces the damage you take from breaking free from being frozen. At first glance, resilience seems like it is the way to go for PvE. I mean, who doesn't want more health? The issue with resilience are the low values that each tier provides. Going from tier 0 all the way up to tier 10 with 100 stat points invested, you can see that your shield only increases by 13%. Since your shield is only part of your character's total health pool, this 13% increase doesn't even increase your total health by 13%. In endgame content, the difference between no resilience and full resilience might be a single bullet. In regular activities, this might be slightly different, but ultimately, it still won't make a huge difference. Now, all this being said, there are still reasons that you may want to run high or even max resilience. A few months ago, we did get a huge resilience change that drastically affected the way that Well of Radiance and Word of Dawn take damage. Both of these supers now take increased damage from bosses. This damage just applies to the super itself, which after taking too much damage will cause the super to be destroyed. Well of Radiance will now take 1.5 times damage from bosses when you are at 0 resilience. If you happen to max your resilience out, this multiplier will return back to the normal 0.25x that Well used to be at normally. The exact same holds true for the Word of Dawn or Bubble super. The only difference is that Bubble takes way more damage from bosses. This range goes from 0.2x, which was the original value, all the way up to 7x when running 0 resilience. Ultimately, I would run resilience for 2 reasons. One would be if I'm running Bubble Titan for survivability during a boss encounter. This is for obvious reasons. You don't want your bubble to die when people are relying on it to keep them alive. If you are running it for a boss encounter just for weapons of light, chances are a boss won't really shoot at the bubble if you're just dipping into it. So you won't really need high resilience here. Also, if you are running this for survivability during an encounter when a boss is not present, then the resilience changes won't matter because they only apply to bosses. The second reason I would run resilience is because this stat affects the Titan's cooldown for their class ability or barricades. This will come down to a personal decision on how often you use the barricade, but base cooldown starts at 52 seconds and max resilience will bring this down to only 14 seconds. Now you might still be thinking, should I run resilience when using Well of Radiance? And in almost every single case, my answer is no. Once again, if you use wells to stay alive during non-boss encounters, resilience makes no difference here. When in boss encounters, your well will get destroyed if it takes too much damage, especially when under light, like during contest mode, but there are two easy workarounds for this. First, you can, in almost every single case, place the staff or sword of your well behind something. The sword at the center of the well is the only hitbox that takes damage, so as long as this can't be shot or isn't hit with too much splash damage, it will survive. Second, you can also position your team away from the center of the well if there isn't any cover for the sword to be placed behind. This way, splash damage that is dealt to the well will be minimized and there will be a low chance for the well to be hit by the boss. Overall, I would say there is almost never a reason to actually run resilience except for the few cases on Titan. Before I continue with the rest of these stats, if you find this video useful, don't forget to drop a like and sub down below. Subbing is completely free, it helps me out a ton, and you can always change your mind later. The third and by far most important stat is recovery. Recovery decreases the time that it takes to start healing both your health bar and shield. As I said, this is the most important stat in the game. So much so that if I only had 100 stat points total, I would put every single one of them into recovery. In endgame content, high recovery makes a huge difference. Looking at these stat values, running max recovery will reduce the time it takes to start healing by 43%. For example, if after taking damage, it takes roughly 2 full seconds to start healing, max recovery would reduce this time to 1.14 seconds, almost cutting the time in half. Recovery and resilience are the only two stats that affect your health in any way, and since resilience is essentially useless, that makes more room to have high recovery and makes this stat that much more useful. The way that you play Destiny in endgame content, especially when under light, ends up being a lot of poking to deal damage to adds or complete mechanics, and then taking cover to recover your health. Reducing the time that you need to recover to full health allows you to play faster and will result in better survivability overall. The last thing to mention about recovery is that this is also the stat that affects the cooldown of the Warlock's class ability, aka their rifts. As you can see, max recovery will take off an entire minute of the rift's cooldown. This is another reason that Warlocks have been meta for PvE and are the most used on day one. You will always be running max recovery in this content, and the Warlocks will benefit the most from this. Max Recov helps you stay alive, and so does being able to place down a healing rift every 40 seconds. Next up, we have Discipline. This stat controls the cooldown of your grenade ability. The base cooldown time will be affected by the grenade that you are running, and using Discipline will provide a percentage change to the cooldown. Discipline is the first of the final 3 stats that actually have negative effects on ability cooldowns. Tier 3 for Discipline has a 0% net neutral effect. As you can see, anything less than Tier 3 has a negative effect, which increases cooldown, and anything above Tier 3 starts to have a positive effect, decreasing your cooldown. High Discipline is what I run secondary to recovery because of how strong grenades are and because of how fast you can get them back with a high stat tier. This stat maxes out at 60% cooldown, which is by far the largest cooldown of any stat or ability. These 3 final stats also show the cooldown time rather than the percentage applied when looking at them in game. I'm currently using an Axion Dart with a base cooldown time of 91 seconds. At Tier 9 Discipline, this is a 54% cooldown, which comes out to 41.86 seconds, which you can see rounded down in game. Depending on your class, Discipline is super important. Most Warlock builds focus around grenade abilities by either consuming these grenades or turning them into something like a healing nade or freezing turret. I think that Titan has some pretty strong nades as well. In my opinion, the Thermite grenade is the best in the game, especially for ad clear and endgame content. On Hunter, I find that the grenades are average, not bad, just nothing insane. Stat number 5 is Intellect. I personally think in PvE that Intellect is highly overrated and overused. The Intellect stat itself controls the cooldown of your super. As you can see via the values on screen, Max Intellect only provides a 23% cooldown to your super. My Nova Bomb has an 8 minute and 20 second cooldown. At tier 4 Intellect, I get a slight cooldown at 5%, which would bring my super cooldown time to roughly 7 minutes and 55 seconds. Once again, you can see this exact time rounded down in game. At a max cooldown of 23%, this same super would take 6 minutes and 25 seconds to fully charge. This does save a whole 2 minutes, but in the current state of the game, supers generate much more quickly by grabbing orbs of power, using builds and exotics, and by just ad clearing. I think that focusing on Intellect isn't something that is super necessary to do if you are efficient at the game. With this, a lot of the mechanics that Bungie designs in raids, especially for boss encounters, gives players plenty of time to build their supers. And with rally banners for each encounter, you'll never go into something without your super fully charged. Even during boss DPS phases, most of the time, if your team burns supers here, like Well, Bubble, Tether, and other damage dealing ones, chances are you can come out of the damage phase with a large portion of your super energy bar already returned. Now, all this being said, after recovery and discipline, I still think Intellect is the next stat that most players should focus on. I mentioned that this is overrated so that people don't think they need to have this stat maxed out going into day ones and other endgame activities. In very few cases, will having extremely high intellect make a huge difference, and most of these cases don't occur in day one raids. Overall, just to say it again, intellect is my third priority when focusing on stats. Once again, this will be right after discipline, which I focus on after getting max recovery. As long as your intellect is tier 3 or higher, you should be fine for endgame content and for day one raiding, because there won't be any negative effects. The last and certainly least stat is strength. Strength is absolutely useless. End of story. The stat controls the cooldown of a character's charged melee ability. Just to go over the stats, you can see that strength is the exact same as discipline. This ranges from negative 25% to 60%, with tier 3 remaining at 0. Even though this does provide a huge increase to your melee cooldown, melees in endgame content are kind of useless. There are exceptions, but not many. In general, if you walk up to an enemy under light and try to win a melee battle, you're not going to have a good time. Melees should really only be used as a last resort and are only good against the rank and file enemy type. Even ranged melees are not worth playing around. In most cases, they will deal negligible damage to anything. Any melees that provide bonuses can almost always be saved for when that bonus is needed, like the empowered buff on Middle Tree Dawnblade. And in most cases, if you do want to play around a melee ability like the Hunter's Vanishing Smoke, for example, exotics like Omnioculus exist, once again making strength obsolete. The base cooldown for the Devour melee is 1 minute and 15 seconds. At tier 1 strength, I have a negative 14% cooldown, which should take my melee to a recharge rate of 1 minute and 25 seconds. In game, you can see that that is exactly what I have. I'm pretty sure it's obvious to tell, but strength is by far the last thing I put points into. In fact, I try to get as little points in strength as possible because any extra points here are points that could go somewhere else. So just to recap, the order of prioritization on my Warlock is recovery, discipline, intellect. I like to play around 30 mobility. Other than that, I try not to have many points in strength and resilience. On Titan, this order is pretty much the exact same. The only exception is that when running Bubble Titan, I usually play it safe and will reduce my discipline for resilience. I keep my intellect where it is because depending on the frequency of DPS phases, I want to guarantee that I have another bubble ready to go for my team's damage. Just again, playing it safe. On Hunter, my armor isn't set up, but my prioritization is recovery, mobility, discipline, and then intellect. Mobility on Hunter is great for invis dodging in endgame content, or for quick reloads on heavy weapons to deal DPS on bosses, champions, or ultras. If I run Omnioculus, then I don't really need discipline since my grenades will regen via the exotic. If I am on Orpheus rigs, my tether will regen extremely fast against ads, or I might just use tether for boss DPS, so I don't really need intellect here. Some of the stats between characters are going to be a bit dynamic and come down to the builds, subclass, and encounter or activity you are in. But running max recovery always remains constant and will remain the most important stat of all. Anyways, guys, that is all I have for this video, and I hope this was helpful to you and helps you understand Destiny's endgame better. If you want to watch me day one raid for Witch Queen, I have a link to my Twitch channel in the description below. Have a good one. Peace.